Hey everybody, welcome to Cityscape Brewing. I'm Dennis Fields. We've all made a beer that we thought was going to be fantastic and it turned out like crap. Or maybe just not as good as you thought, or maybe you have some off flavors and you haven't really figured out why. Maybe even you've made the same recipe before and one time it turns out really good and another time it doesn't turn out so well. And so we're going to talk about a few things that really aren't based on your recipe at all that you can fix using salts, measuring pH, and other things that sound like a lot of work but are relatively easy to correct and make fantastic beer. So hit that like and subscribe button, grab yourself a beer, and let's get after it. So I'm going to break down this video into kind of three main categories. First we're going to talk about water, then we're going to talk about salt additions, and then we're going to talk about pH. They can all separately affect the flavor and your efficiency of your beer. And so some of those off flavors that you might be getting at the end may not have anything to do with your process other than a few of these other things that you could quickly add into your brew day process, and it's very easy to correct. You may be meticulous on oxidation. You may be meticulous on fermentation temperature, which are both very, very significant things that you should pay attention to. But the biggest thing, no matter if you're an extract brewer or a all grain brewer, is water. Where are you getting it and what type of minerals are in it? So let's start there. There's a couple different things. When I first started brewing, I used spring water from the store. It came in jugs like this one here. And I didn't really pay that much attention to the mineral content. I was just making sure that I didn't have chlorine in it, which is a big deal, right? So after I realized that, water is kind of important, and I made some good beers, but it really depended on the style. But after I realized how important water was and the mineral content was, I didn't really know what the mineral content was of my spring water I was getting. And so what I started doing was just using my standard tap water, making sure that I was doing a few things to remove that chlorine. So first, I was able to get a RV hose filter like this one. This removes any sediment. It also helps take out the chlorine. So I use one of these. And I also, it's kind of a little overkill, but you can do one or the other. Even if you don't have a filter like that, you can get some Campton tablets, which are like these here. These are little white tablets. You actually, these treat up to 10 gallons. So you can break these in half. That will also take the chlorine out. I mean, naturally raising the temperature and stirring it will also help dissipate chlorine. But if you really want to make sure that's out of there, I do both of those steps. Alternatively, you can use RO water, reverse osmosis water, or you can use distilled water like this jug here, right? So right now, it's really difficult to find distilled water in the store. You're gonna go in there, you're gonna see drinking water and spring water, and then a whole empty shelf of distilled water depending on where you are. But right now, in early 2023, that's just the world we live in. But, secret, go check the baby aisle, because right next to all the formulas and stuff will also be distilled water. It'll be about the same price. It's just gonna have a baby on the label. Now, I wouldn't go up and buy all of it because there are families that need that stuff, but you taking 6-7 gallons of it for your brew day probably isn't the end of the world. But they start stocking that stuff first. So if you need it in a pinch, go ahead and grab some of that. I don't use distilled water all that often unless I am making a yeast starter. Then in that case, I will use distilled water for my yeast starters, or even spring water in a pinch. If you are using your tap water, it's really important to get your water profile. It looks like this one here. You can get that from a company like Ward Labs, and I'll have their information in the video description below. They're a great company. You send off a little sample, you take it right from your source where you're gonna get your water. I fill up a little sample, I throw that guy in the mail, and I wait for my returned information on my specific water for my specific use at my house. And so alternatively, there are websites that you can get a water source from. You can look at your local municipality. Sometimes their water profiles will be right on the website. For instance, the city of Charlotte, North Carolina does that. So you can find that there. There are also websites that have some that are available that people have uploaded after receiving their water profile. You can get that as well from a site like Brewer's Friend. They will have a whole list of cities. You can go ahead and just use the search function on that page, find the city, state, or even country that you're in, and find if something is close. Now that may not get specific, but it's going to get you a lot closer than just guessing what your water profile is. So now that we know what our water profile is, and we know all of our calcium, magnesium, sulfate, that kind of stuff in our water, what now? Well, the easiest thing to do is to use a calculator online. There are several of them available. You can use them through Brewing Water, Brewfather has some. There's an easy calculator that I use sometimes in a pinch, but most of the time I use one from Brewer's Friend, which is a website that I store most of my recipe data in. So I'm able to link my recipe specifically into that water calculator. It puts all of my grains that I'm using in there, and then I can add salt additions pretty easily, and we'll show an example of how to do that after we discuss what type of salts and what additions that you're going to want to look for. There are three main salt additions that I use all of the time, and that is calcium chloride, that's this one here, gypsum, which is a finer powder, and Epsom salt, which you can find at your grocery store. You don't necessarily have to buy this at a homebrew supply store. I'll have links for these things also in the video description below so you can easily find them. But make sure if you're buying Epsom salt, especially at the store, there's a lot of them that are meant for like soaking your feet or taking a bath in and stuff, and they'll have different oils and scents and that kind of stuff. So make sure you're getting an unscented, fragrance-free version of Epsom salt. The ingredients on the back should just say Epsom salt. All three of those will actually lower the pH of your wort and ultimately your mash when you add those to your water. But it may not always add or lower it enough, right? And so depending on the beer style that you're doing and the grains that you're using are very important. So the water calculator will take into consideration the grains you're using. If you're doing a light and hoppy flavored beer, you might have very pale malts, in which case your pH of your water, which typically tends to be in the kind of 7 to 8 range when you get it out of your tap, that may be a little high, and you may end up with 5.6, 5.8, or even over 6 in your mash, and that will lead to kind of astringent flavors overall when you get done with your beer. And sometimes even described as like soapy flavored. And so what you'll want to make sure is that you're lowering that pH in addition to adding salt. So you may have hit your mineral content and your salt content perfectly, but your pH is still a little high. Well, what can you do? Well, there's a couple of things that lower your pH without adding any additional salts. And that is, the first is lactic acid, which is like this. What I do is I generally add this using a medicine syringe. You don't have to buy one of these. You just go to like CVS, Walgreens, or your drugstore, ask them for a medicine syringe, and they'll give you one of these things over the counter. And the other thing that you can do, and sometimes is a little easier, is just add some acidulated malt. So I have some right here. You don't have to add very much of it. This is probably half a pound or something like that. And you really only need a few ounces up to maybe a half a pound, depending on the style of beer that you're using, in order to lower that pH. What acidulated malt is malt that has been introduced to lactic acid after the drying process and then goes through a secondary drying process. So lactic acid is naturally found on the grains, and this is very commonly used in European countries like Germany that have very strict standards on only using, the 4 base ingredients in making beer, barley, water, hops, and yeast, right? And so very commonly found there. Sometimes though, you need to actually raise your pH level up. Maybe you're making, or maybe your water profile is low to begin with, you're making a very dark beer. And so like stouts, porters, something like that, and actually drops below the recommended range of pH, which is anywhere between 5.1 and 5.6, right? And so in that case, you'll want to add something like baking soda. There's a couple of other things you can use, but baking soda readily found in almost every grocery store or in your cupboards already in your house. So you can grab some of this stuff in a pinch. Darker malts have more acidic qualities to them. And so you'll find that it drops the pH of your mash already. And you may not need to add as many salts, nor would you need to add any lactic acid or acidulated malt into your recipe. In some cases, like we just talked about, it actually gets too low and you need to add baking soda. So that may be why you make really, really good dark beers, and your lighter colored beers, more hoppier beers, or pale ales, for instance, come out a little more malty or even astringent that it's somehow it's got these off flavors, even though you're taking your time on your brewing process. It could just be because of pH. So let's talk about pH specifically and why it's important. It really helps, especially during your mash, to ensure that you have a good efficiency. It breaks down those protein gums and starches, and it converts them into sugar. And having that correct pH between that 5.2-ish to 5.6 Your overall beer can be a little bit lower, but the mash wants to be a little higher at either 5.2 to 5.6. So during fermentation, after you get done mashing, it's also important, helps yeast viability, helps the conversion of those sugars now to alcohol, and it will ultimately help your yeast do their job better. But also, in your final beer flavor, it can be affected if your pH is too high or too low, but generally a lot of people see their pH is too high. And so you'd have to get fairly high to get very astringent beers, but it doesn't take a whole lot higher than 5.6 before you start seeing those off flavors, and they're not, maybe not very perceived when you're tasting it, but they're going to be there, and there's going to be just something about it that maybe has that kind of homebrew taste, right? And so getting that pH in check using the acidulated malt, the lactic acid, or the baking soda after you've added your water additions is super important. I would also highly recommend getting a pH meter like this one here. This is a relatively cheap one. You can get this for $30 or under, and you can actually test your house pH. This will also help you when you're actually doing your mash process, and say you want to add something like lactic acid. You can actually test your mash while you have it, all of your grains mixed in, and then add a little bit at a time in order to get it to that perfect pH balance, right? But I use this specifically for sours all the time, so having one of these on hand is a really good idea. So next, I'm going to specifically show you how I edit my water additions and pH using Brewer's Friend app on their website. All right, we are editing a recipe here in Brewer's Friend on their website. I'm calling this one Northwest Trail IPA. I put in my fermentables, which are Pilsner and Vienna malts. I've also put in hops that I'm going to be using, but again, that stuff right now is just not important. We're going to be talking about water. So this one has some pretty light base malts in it, and therefore it's going to be not dropping that pH. And as you can tell, we have pretty high pH as we've set up our recipe here. Brewer's Friend has kind of already told us, it's a pretty high. We need to get that lower somehow. I have not put any salt additions or water additions in this yet, and I have not added any acidulated malt or anything that would correct that. And so we're going to show you how to do that. So first, go down to the bottom. You're going to see kind of the water chemistry area of the website. I have my water profile, my source in here, but you can also add that by just entering a water source at the top of the page, or as we're doing our recipe corrections, which I'm going to show you in a little bit. So we're going to go in here, and when you see this water calculator down at the bottom, you're going to select Edit. This is going to open up a different page, and it's going to then allow you to see everything you're going to need to know. So it's going to kind of try and guess what your water volumes are that you're going to need based on your mash and sparge. I use a different water calculator, but these are fairly close. I generally use about 4.5 gallons or so for my mash, and then I'm going to change this to 4.75 for my sparge water. So I do a batch sparge process. So overall, I use about 9.2 gallons or so, and this can be a little bit off, but this is just getting you in the ballpark, right? And so we're not going to use different water sources for our mash and sparge. We're going to use the same water source, but we are going to break these two up as far as adding salt additions. I'm going to show you how to do that. Here's where you would add your water source information. So we got that water report from Ward Labs. We got all of that information put in here. So it's going to give us everything we need to know: calcium, magnesium, sodium, chloride, that kind of stuff, right? It also has our pH in there of 8 down here at the bottom. So the next thing we need to do is decide what kind of beer that we're doing. There's a lot of different target profiles in here, and if you're just doing like a standard IPA or pale ale, you may want a balanced profile depending on if you want to get even malt versus bitterness, hop, flavor, aroma, that kind of stuff. But there's also a light colored and malty and light colored and hoppy option. And then there's a whole bunch of different ones, whether you're doing stouts, Scottish ales, dark ales, porters, that kind of thing, that will help you dial in what your water should be when you're done adding all of your malts and all of your salt additions. So we're going to go ahead and use the light colored and hoppy, because in this case we're going to use a lot of light colored malts, and we want it to be an overly hoppy West Coast style IPA. So after we've selected this, you can tell just below that it's actually going to tell us what our actual measurements are for each of these different minerals, and then where we are lacking in these different minerals and where we need to either bring these down or bring them up, right? And so this is where we're going to be adding salts to adjust these numbers so they're within an acceptable range, and when they're in an acceptable range, they are green, okay? You can also see that at the bottom of the page, if you scroll all the way down, where these, it's kind of your mash, pH, and your overall water report. It kind of shows that these areas are low. Some of them are within a normal range, but this area up here gives you the specific numbers that you're really trying to meet for the red and green areas. So first of all, we're going to start talking about adding salts to the mash, and then we'll talk a little bit about adding, adjusting the pH, right? And so we're going to see what the salts do to the pH, and then we're going to adjust the pH after that. So we're going to go ahead and start with our salt additions, and there's an option here that says salt additions to mash only. I do not do that. If you are doing a brew in a bag, you would check this, okay? Because you're not going to be doing any type of sparge water or sparge separately, right? That's going to be one bag. So if you use a Grainfather or some other electric brew system, you would click this button because you want to add all of your salts at the same time. Secondly, there's a second option down here if you have sparge, right? So you're going to have sparge kettle salt additions. And so in that case, we're going to just start our regular salts. This is going to be just for our mash. And I kind of know what I need to add to my specific profile in order to get it to, or at least close, right? So I'm going to start by adding 2 grams of gypsum. I'm going to add 1 gram of Epsom salt, and then 2 grams of calcium chloride. And there's 2 options here. This first one, dihydrate versus anhydrous. And I know I'm pronouncing that probably wrong a little bit, but this one is the more common one. If you forget, if you hover over this little thing, this one just says, this is the most common one, right? So sometimes I forget that and I'm like, which one is it again? So this one is the most common. I usually have to add about 2 grams of that as well. So let's see by adding those, what that did to our numbers up here. So they changed them a little bit, but they have not adjusted enough, right? And so we know that we're also going, and this is for the overall water, not just our mash. So we're not looking at this right away. We want to add them in both our mash and our sparge. And you can see that our pH right here is still high. That'll be listed here and down towards the bottom when we get to the bottom. But let's also add that same amount of gypsum, of calcium chloride, and Epsom salt to our sparge water. So the same amount. So we have 2, 1, and 2. So let's do that down here. In our sparge kettle salt additions, we're going to say 2 grams of gypsum, 1 gram of Epsom salt, and 2 grams of calcium chloride. Now let's see where we're at. So if we go down to the bottom, it's going to say that we're in a fairly normal range for everything. And we're halfway balanced as far as what our flavor is supposed to be. And so that may be enough for you, and you can say, oh, look, we're good. We're in our normal ranges, and your beer will turn out better than if you didn't do this, right? The next thing you can do, though, is come up to the top and see how close specifically. We have some numbers that are a little bit low and a little bit high. And so specifically calcium, chloride, sulfate, right? Those things have some adjustments that we need to have done here, and we're going to see how that gets affected. So we have calcium here. We're going to go down to here, and we're going to see which of these adds calcium. Well, we can definitely add calcium by adding calcium and chloride, and calcium and sulfate, and then we have magnesium and sulfate in this as well. So what I'm going to do is adjust some of these numbers to get these to be all green, right? And we're going to do that for both the mash and sparge. So I'm going to take and put 3 grams of gypsum in. We're going to try that. That changed this, as you can tell. Our calcium's now right in where we need it to be. What if we changed calcium chloride also to 3? And that's good. It didn't quite bring the chloride in there, but we need to make sure that we are in an acceptable range there. So we also need to do that in our sparge. Let's see if we add both 1 here and 1 here to raise those to 3, and then go back up to the top. That's actually put us a little bit over in both of our categories, right? So now we're over in chloride and over in calcium. So we're going to need to probably drop off this back to 2, and let's see where we're at. Because that's calcium and chloride, both of those are over. We're going to see where we're at there. That's brought the calcium back into the green. The chloride is still a little high. So we actually need to remove some chloride, which means we're looking at the ones that have chloride only. These two do not. So we're going to have to remove some calcium chloride. So let's take and we'll start with our sparge water first and bring this down to, where's our sparge? Okay, here it is. Sorry, calcium chloride. We got 1, and we're going to leave the other one at 2 and see where we're at. That's brought the chloride to 1.5. Okay, so that's perfect. We're not over, we're in the green for calcium and chloride. Our sulfate though is a little bit low. And so we don't want to add more calcium, so we know our gypsum is probably okay, but we do need to add sulfate, which is also found in Epsom salt, right? Magnesium sulfate. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to add a little bit here as well and see where we're at. It looks like that is still a little low there, so we're going to add it again at the bottom. Add that to 2 and see where we're at. So that's brought all these categories into the green. However, I'm looking at, after adding all the items that lower our mash pH, I'm seeing that our mash is still a little high. Not crazy high, but a little high. We want that to be closer to 5.2, right? So this is a crisp, clean, more bitter beer than malty beer. And if we leave this high, it will have more perceived maltiness and less perceived hoppy aromatic flavor that we're looking for in the Northwest IPA. So there's only really a couple of ways to do that. You can go down and you can add an acidic item to your mash. So this is add acid additions, and you can choose to add lactic acid here, and that's the 88% concentration that we had in our bottle. That's very common at a homebrew supply store. And then you can choose to add some amount. In this case, I think it's probably closer to like 8 milliliters. So we're going to go ahead and just put milliliters, and then we're going to see what that does. Oh look, it's down already to 5.45, right? Did that change any of our numbers up here? Absolutely it did, right? You can now see our bicarbonate number is actually in the green as well by adding that lactic acid, right? So we could actually then save this and update our recipe. So instead of using lactic acid though, let's take that back out. And say you wanted to use acidulated malt. So we're going to go ahead and just say we're not using this anymore. Well, we can just leave that, doesn't matter. And our mash is back up to 5.69, and our bicarbonate is still high. So what we're going to do is save this. By pushing save, this actually goes to our recipe. If we go to here, and then I'm just going to go to view and refresh it. And it will actually add in, go back to edit, add in those salt additions from our water profile, right? So we don't need to add these in separately, it's added them for us. It knows how much we want to add of each of these in both our mash and our sparge, so that's done for you already, so that's helpful. The other thing we can do though is add our acidulated malt right now up on the top in our fermentables section. So rather than lactic acid, if you don't have any and you're going to the homebrew supply store and you're just going to pick up some acidulated malt, you can go ahead and add that here. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in. So we're going to call it acidulated malt. And then I generally start with about half a pound. So you could do 0.5 here, and we'll see where that gets us. We go up to the top, we look at our mash. That's dropped from 5.7 to 5.31, so just right about where we need to be. So I was aiming for about 5.2 to 5.3, totally fine. Again, your overall mash pH wants to be a little bit higher than maybe the overall pH of your beer overall. So that can be anywhere between 5.1 and 5.6, but your mash pH wants to be a little tiny bit higher. And so in this case, I'm happy with that. We can go back down. We can actually push save on this and then go back down to our water calculator. We're going to close this one out just so it reopens a new window. and we go to and we say edit here, or you could have left that window open really, but you can push reload on the top. There's a way to reload your information. It'll say right here, reload recipe on the top once you scroll down far enough. And now in your grist area, which is all of your grains, it will have added that acidulated malt, and that'll take that mash pH into consideration. So that's how I generally get that down. You can add a little bit more if you want to. So say you wanted to add that, get that right down to 5.2, you can do that. I'm okay with that being, 0.1 off. 5.3 is just fine. A lot of people are shooting for 5.2 to 5.4. 5.3 is right there in the middle. And so we come down to the bottom, all of our levels are in here, but you will see that, though, that it says that our ratio is 2.8 more bitter. Well, that's on purpose because of the style that we're going with, right? So if we were to go back up to the top, and all of these are perfect, that's because we're going with a light colored and hoppy beer, and that's gonna help us get those perceived bitterness from that style of beer. If we were to change this though, to balanced, we would get different numbers and we'd have to adjust this again. But if we go down to the bottom, this is still going to say more bitter because we haven't changed anything. You could get this to balanced down here, and balanced would be right at 1.0. But again, you're going to try and shoot to make these numbers all green depending on the style of beer you're making. And as you can see, water's kind of a big deal. So you may have a perfect recipe and you just need to make these minor adjustments for just a few dollars of some salts, and you're good to go. In most cases, you're only going to need to add 1 or 2 different things. Once you've dialed in your water profile and know what that is, it should be very consistent from beer to beer. You're just changing it slightly based on the style of beer that you're brewing. So if you have any questions, comments, leave them in the video description below. Hit that like and subscribe button. Happy brewing, and cheers. Thanks for watching my video. I really do appreciate it. Another couple ways that you can help support the channel is by hitting that like and subscribe button. You can also check out the merchandise in our store. I have other shirts. We got glassware, we got stickers, hats, sweatshirts, etc. Go check it out. Also, hit that video here. You know you want to.